Welcome, everyone. My name is Yemi, and this is Jen. We are your hosts, and we're really excited to have an amazing guest. I've known her for a little while now and just love what comes out of her mouth every single time. Her name is Kerry Howard. She's a trauma expert, and I'm not going to go any further, but to ask you, Kerry, to introduce who you are, because you just gave a term here that I don't even want to use the words, but what do you do and who are you?
I just called myself the pink shrink. I'm a best-selling author, a psychologist primarily, but, I'm hoping to give up that term shortly. Trauma prevention strategist. I do a lot of stuff in the sort of trauma space, trying to help people understand how trauma is at the basis of all of our problems and what we can do to help resolve them.
And do you mind if I ask, what made you go into the space of trauma? Because I'm still doing work on this and it's not really dinner table conversation. Now, I know that obviously you've been in the realm of psychology and we'll maybe understand why you want to move away from that. But what made you go into it?
Interestingly, I started studying again as a mature student. Originally, I wanted to be a school counsellor. So I decided I would go and study to do that. And at the time, they'd only just changed the rules and you had to do a psychology degree as opposed to a teaching degree at that point. So I was a mature student anyway, so I was in my late 20s and I already had a couple of young children. So I enrolled to go and do psychology as a mature student with the idea that I wanted to go and work with adolescents. And I think looking back on it, it was because adolescence was challenging for me, I would say. And I kind of felt like I'd learned a few things, but I wanted to help other people in the same sort of situation. But my first year into my psychology degree and I got hit by a bus as a pedestrian and I suffered PTSD. And I went through a good 12 months of therapy and having to take antidepressant medication, and I was not the sort of person that I would have ever thought would be depressed, just because that didn't seem to be a thing that I would do. But sure enough, I was very depressed to the point that I was suicidal at one point, and I had 2 young children. So engaging in a therapeutic process that really allowed me to not only resolve those challenges, but I then had to resolve all of the other issues from my life that I hadn't dealt with and in fact had repressed up until that point. And so I say to people, the bus kind of saved my life, but it did it by knocking all of the stuff out of my repressed memory area in my, gut somewhere and made me deal with all of it.
Yeah. That tends to happen as adults. I see that over and over again. It's like there's a trigger in adulthood that just kind of almost, it's like kind of ripping the lid off the can, and it's not just the accident or the current day situation. It's like that whole can of worms opens up.
And I think a big part is, and I remember the therapist at the time saying to me, it's just because, because the bus accident, I blamed myself, right? I felt really stupid about the fact, about what had happened. It takes too long for me to explain it all to you. But in essence, every other time in my life where I felt like I'd made a mistake or I'd done the wrong thing came up to haunt me. So I often talk to people about the fact that we carry our traumatic issues with us like a toy box that we've got somewhere in our gut. And it's like every time a bad thing happens, we open it up, we shove another thing in and we try and shut the lid. And it just gets to the point in your adulthood where it just won't shut anymore because it's too full. And that's where a therapeutic process can help, because you kind of sometimes need somebody else to sit with you and go through all of that stuff and work out what you need to keep and what you could probably get rid of.
You know what, Kerry, I think this is what this is what I'm attracted to you about. And I don't think I've ever had the chance. Well, firstly, I didn't know that story, and I guess it's because we've never had a conversation to this context, is you have these brilliant analogies that just make my mind want to create a mini documentary or pictures. Can we just dissect a bit? Because this is the other thing. I think when we either go to a therapist, a practitioner, healer, psychologist, we assume that they have all their shit sorted out. I don't even know if this is I don't know whether I can use profanities, but
I don't think anybody's got their shit sorted out.
No?
It's a fallacy. But I'm going to say it's a fallacy perpetuated by certain members of certain professions because that's what they want everybody to believe. But the reality is, I think that what makes me a good therapist is the fact that I'm real And I don't sit there and tell you that my life is all perfect and it's all wonderful, Rosie, and don't you worry, you just listen to me and do exactly as you're told and all things will be fine, because it's just bullshit. Sorry.
Yeah,
No, look,
second
I
that.
appreciate, I mean, Jen, but please go ahead. I just want to quickly I guess for me, not being a therapist or psychologist, someone on the other side who's almost trying to have this bird's eye view or plan view, I think that's it. A lot of us feel shame about coming forward. And I think for me, it felt so much better whenever I spoke to a therapist, a psychologist, that everybody's still figuring it out. It's just that some have a lot more information to help us than others. So yeah, thank you for being real and keeping it real.
That's all right. I often say to people, like, it was always, I see what I do as a gift that I have that I just need to, share. That's why I was brought to Earth, is the way I look at it. And I think the ability to be able to find, your right spot or your rhythm to make that happen. And I think some of the most wonderful experiences I've had is where I've had clients who've gone through the process with me and they've come out the other side and then said, I want to do this and help other people. Because I actually think that that's a normal part of how we develop as human beings, when we've had these difficulties and we start to see ourselves very differently on the other side of them. And then we want other people to, be able to know that you can also resolve it as well.
Sorry, Jen, I think you were going to say or ask something.
No, I'd just love to learn more about the process that you take people through.
So in my new book, In the Trouble with Trauma, I talk about how we kind of all got here as human beings. I lovingly say I like to normalize our human experiences and just show people how we need to routinely resolve the challenges that life throws at us, right? So primarily I'm an EMDR therapist. So EMDR is level 1 treatment for PTSD, but it really works for all traumatic experiences. And primarily it's because when we have those traumatic experiences, particularly if we blame ourselves, they end up being stored away in our memory network. And, I'd say to people, when you have a traumatic experience, it's like you make jelly, right? And so we poured the jelly crystals and we poured the hot water in, and we just need to allow time for it to set. But once it's set, it doesn't change. So you didn't grow up in Australia, but I'm sure some of the people watching would remember the old frog in the pond, which used to be one of those desserts that we would have at birthday parties when we were kids. And so in order to get a frog in the pond, you took a chocolate Freddo frog and you had to wait till the jelly was almost sort of set but not too hard before you could put the frog in, otherwise the frog would melt. But once it fully set, it got stuck there. And I use that analogy a lot about traumatic experience, that it's like the frog in the pond. The chocolate frog represents the shit part of whatever happened in your traumatic experience, and it gets stuck. So if we have a traumatic experience within the first 6 hours, your brain starts to consolidate the information associated with that incident. So if you're blaming yourself, by the time you go to sleep that night, then, that idea is going to be set a bit more like jelly. And so then the next day, it's still a little bit flexible, but over time, so once we've hit about 3 days, then it starts to be really quite firmly set. And after 3 weeks, it's kind of like, yeah, we're really going to have to just about get a jackhammer out on the concrete that's set around it. And so I just find that's an easy way to help people understand that when something bad happens and really difficult, especially if we're blaming ourselves, that's the thing that we need to kind of put our hand up and do something about sooner rather than later. And the neighbours have decided to mow the lawn.
Oh, good.
Yeah, oh, good. I can't really hear it at all. So I'd love to learn more about exactly how EMDR works, because I've never experienced it. I've never used it. So I'd love to, just understand a bit more.
So originally it was developed as just an eye movement. It stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That's what the EMDR is for. But over time, what we've worked out is that when we bilaterally stimulate the body, so we're moving from side to side, because remember, your brain's got 2 halves. In the middle, we have a very thick nerve fiber bundle called the corpus callosum. So when we have information that gets I want you to think about it. When the traumatic injury occurs, it's like we take the information and we separate one part on one side of the brain and the other half on the other side. So it's like I might have the detail of what happened here, but all of the emotion is stored on the other side of our brain. So once that kind of settles in, then we need to reconnect those bits of information to enable us to process it through. So EMDR actually gets you to bring up the emotion, because the physical expression of the emotion, that's where storytelling comes in. We tell our story, we bring up the emotion stored in our body somewhere, and I'll get to the body memory shortly, but then we use eye movement, or we use another form of bilateral stimulation, or we use, in my case, I often work with multiple inputs. So we might use tactile stimulation of the hands, which might be that go from hand to hand. We're doing eye movement, which we're doing at the same time, and auditory inputs we can get as well. So anything that moves from side to side. But that's why I say to people, even, walking or running, people who are trying to resolve their stress, if they're runners, they go for a run and they're thinking about the bad things that happen in their day, and they go home, they feel better by laterally moving.
Yeah. So I guess what's coming up for me as you're describing it, I'm like, I wonder what the impact is of also being in a safe space relationally with you, that they're kind of re-experiencing the feeling and the emotion, and you're there as like that sort of safe, loving presence as I'm feeling you, Yeah, I'm just wondering about that.
I think there's definitely an element of that, but there is also a reasonable consistency to the process. So holding the space is one thing, but I think helping people to understand that, and especially in my case, as an EMDR, I'm an EMDR consultant, but I've had a lot of EMDR therapy. I came to it because I was trying to resolve the PTSD around the bus accident. I know that it works. I know that it's effective. I know that it allows us to resolve all sorts of things, not just what we consider to be big T trauma things, right?
Yeah.
So it's any negative belief that we hold about ourselves or any negative feelings that we have, and we store that in the body. So in the book, I actually explain to people about how when those traumatic incidents occur, that we also have muscle memory associated with it, but they all overlay the central nervous system in such a way that where we look at our central nervous system nodes, which in different terms we might refer to as our chakras or our meridians, that they come through that central part of the body. And that's actually when we start talking about issues in relationships, people will always say, I feel it in my chest. If I feel like I should have known better, people will often say, I feel that in my head. That's the third eye insight, right? If I wanted to speak up for myself, I feel that in my throat.
Yeah.
If I feel disconnected from society, I feel it in my belly, in my gut. So our body is really essential, and being in touch with our bodies is actually really quite important when we're trying to talk about how we resolve our traumatic incidences and our traumatic memories.
I'm like, okay, I've got so many questions. I mean,
go, Yenny.
You need an audio book of some sort, because I think your words, when I read your book, I hear your voice in it, but you break it down in a way that my brain is happy. I want to ask a question, because you said what people would call chakra meridian points. What do you think is the relationship between what, I don't know, some might call traditional, and let's just call the psychological world, and non-traditional modalities? What's happened? Have we medicalized everything that really was the case?
Yep. I think that what happened was we tried to fully understand our world through a scientific lens. And I think this is actually the problem with modern psychology. I do actually write about it. You go back to your traditional kind of Indian or Chinese kind of, 5,000-year-old ancient systems. They actually look at the world in pretty consistent ways. They look at, the order of things. They look at how we get in touch with our body, how we, do natural medicine. There's all of these different things that, even though the cultures were quite different, that they consistently did. And I think we see that in some of the other ancient cultures that are a bit more melded in places like Europe, like, my family, all that Celtic background stuff. So I think there's lots of what I want to call ancient wisdom that then got overlaid with a system that we wanted to control. And so in order to control it, we wanted to understand the things that seem to have some level of mysticism about them. So, I can't see it, therefore I want to understand it in a way that makes it feel like it's tangible rather than being intangible. And so we tried to medicalize this whole system. And, it's part of the reason why I say about wanting to step away from psychology. It's almost become this very rigid kind of system that says, no, you can't look at anything outside, like your spirituality, like your connection to, things that are unknown. And God forbid that we touch anybody. I'm not allowed to touch anybody.
What was part of your, so like literally if you just wanted to touch someone on their shoulder, is that, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, you get told you're not allowed to touch people, right? So if somebody's crying, and even if I wanted to give them a hug, I'm not allowed to. Like, I'm not supposed to do that. I can hand them a tissue, but you know what? As you well know, sometimes when you're in a situation, and people tell me some, pretty deep things about their lives, and you should be able to actually show what is genuine human emotion and concern, right? Mm-hmm. But no, my professional boundaries somehow say that, no, I'm supposed to have this invisible line between me and the person that I'm working with. And I just don't think that it's not only is it not practical or reasonable, but I don't actually think that it's therapeutically beneficial.
Well, and also when I hear that, I think, well, that could be re-traumatizing for some people, because they might be telling you something that they've never shared with anyone before, and maybe they did share it with someone who couldn't hear it, maybe their mother, and who couldn't hear it and couldn't meet them there, and then they're sharing it again with somebody else, and again there's no humanistic response, no touch, no comfort. It's like, it's so counterintuitive.
It's not human. It's
Yeah.
not human for not to have those emotional kind of connections that also naturally have some level of physical connection.
Yeah.
And I talk about that in the book, that our number one emotional need is for connection.
Yeah.
And the reason trauma is such a problem is because trauma creates a disconnect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I want to go back to like I said, my brain, you speak and then I just start. So I have this vision of this toy box. There used to be these toy boxes that the toys are in and they splurt out. So you try to quickly dump it in and close it in. If that's the case, and I wrote here, what was it you said? The bus hitting you, this isn't what you said, but this is what I heard. The bus hitting you kind of saved your life because it kind of cracked you open to look at everything else. Now, a lot of people don't accept it. I mean, I definitely didn't accept that. Maybe I'd undergone a traumatic event until almost 2-3 decades later. What advice or guidance can you give people who are just saying, I don't want to open that box? Are we saying inevitably a bus is coming? I mean, what's your thoughts?
So, my general thought about it is that inevitably the bus comes to all of us, right? So, and I say that because the toy box analogy is one of those ones I say to people. The bus smashed my toy box and strewn everything up and down the road, and there was no way I could possibly try and get it back together. And, it was just like most of the time, I think about it like a suitcase. You can sit on it, you can shove it shut, but this wasn't going to happen for me. Now, I don't recommend everybody get hit by a bus, okay? It would be much better if the virtual bus, you made a decision that it would be really good at some point to ask somebody. I kind of think about it like when you want somebody to come and organise your closet, right? You go to a therapist because you kind of go, rather than waiting for a bus, that you go, I just need somebody to help me organise my toy box of crap in here, that I just want to make sure I can get rid of what I don't really need anymore, the things that are not serving me, right? And we see that, and I think what happens is we tend to see patterns in our life, but because we feel like we don't know that there's a reliable way to resolve it, we try to repress and ignore it. And let's face it, that's actually what our society tells us to do. And we do it to our children. In the book, I talk about, that we teach our children to dissociate. We teach them to disconnect from their body. We teach them to not feel. And we do it because we tell them all the time that that's not what they're feeling. Whoever did that to their children? Yeah, I mean, we all did, all right? Our job as mothers is to just recognise that we've got to feel guilty for all the bad things that we did and just pay for therapy, okay? It's fine.
Hold on. This sounds like a very expensive life. It's only things like, I call it recycled trauma. But really, what if knowing what we know now, what could we be saying to our children that's different from how we grew up?
So the main analogy I use that helps people understand this, right, is that so when we see a child who falls over and they scrape their knee, okay, so what's the first thing that we do as human beings to validate whether or not the knee is an issue?
Look for blood.
Right. Now, what happens if there's no blood?
You're okay.
Yeah. But are they okay? Does it still hurt? It does still hurt, right? And so the issue is that then I talk about this, about magic kisses, right? Magic kisses are not pandering to a child who's just going to be a Nancy-pantsy boy, right? Magic kisses actually work because when we kiss the site, the adult brain is validating to the child that there is a problem. And all the numbing chemicals that your brain releases at the surface of the skin that numb it actually go into effect the minute that the parent validates it. The child needs the external validation for their brain to kick in and do what comes naturally. It's why when we hurt ourselves, we rub it. And when we rub it, we actually activate those surface cells. And it's the same thing when we kiss a child's wound better. So it's not that it just magically disappears. It's that the brain has a way of actually bringing natural numbing chemicals to that area as soon as we give it some validation. So when people have injuries, what we find is, I see this in workers' comp and stuff in particular, the more they have to fight to validate their experiences, the more protracted their injury actually becomes. So the first thing I say with organisations is, the minute that somebody's reporting that there's a problem, we need to give them clear validation. But instead what we do is go through and go, well, who's right, who's wrong? And we apply this judgment to it. We don't need to apply the judgment to it. It's the same as what we do with our children. We don't need to apply the judgment. We just need to acknowledge the pain. And that's why I say to people, sorry is not an admission of liability. It is the acknowledgement of another person's pain.
Yes.
That's it.
Oh, yes.
I love that.
Yeah. I remember going to school when I left Nigeria and went to school in England. A friend hit her toe and I said, sorry, because that's what we just did. We just said sorry, but it was usually acknowledgement. And then I had to stop it because she couldn't understand why I would apologize for something that I was not the cause of. And so I carried that culture. But just going back to the fall, you kind of twisted me around. As you were speaking, the African culture in me was like, well, where does resilience get built? But as you come by if we kiss the fall, because if we fell, I mean, you would have probably experienced it as well. It would be like, just keep on moving. Like there's no blood, there's no pain. And if we pander, this is what my head was saying, if we pander to it, then where's the resilience built? But I think I just heard you say it's actually the acknowledgement.
That's right. And so we often think that the only way that we build resilience, and this is part of the reason why I developed the mental muscle method as a 12-week program, right? Because there's a lot of resilience building programs out there that are like one day. It doesn't make any sense that we could build resilience in one day. What most people talk about as resilience, especially in this COVID culture, is repression. It's not resilience at all. Resilience is your ability to be able to see a difficulty and work a way around it. It's problem-solving skills. And that's actually one of the problems that we have with the younger generation now, is that they were raised by parents who have protected them from the world, and they don't learn how to problem-solve their way through some of these challenges. So kissing the wound better has nothing to do with their resilience. It's got to do with teaching them to repress and get on with it regardless. That's put the cement on your Wheaties, honey, and keep moving. Actually, when we acknowledge it, it gets resolved quicker. And what happens is we get a reinforcement that says, actually, what we experience in our body is real and valid, and we just need to work out a way to move through it and find a solution around whatever it is that we're experiencing. So what we've traditionally, and I'm glad that you said that, because from a cultural perspective, you know, all the English stiff upper lip stuff as well, it's that same sense of just push it down rather than actually, no, let's look at what this is and what do we need to do about that.
Yeah. So much food for thought. Jen, I could keep going. I don't know if you've got anything coming up for you that you want to
I'm just
ask.
thinking about my daughter, actually, and when in those moments, you know, when you're being busy mom and no, you're right, you're good, you know, and you carry on. And the moment that I turn around and say, did you get a fright? And her whole she'll be like, you know, it's terrible, it's terrible. And I said, did you catch a big fright? And she'll go, yes, I got a big fright, mommy. And I'm like, and do you need a hug? And she'll be like, yes, I need a hug. And you can just feel her whole system going down with that, the validation and the acknowledgement. And yes, it's the physical hurt, but it's also, yeah, I got a fright and I'm having like a really strong reaction physically and emotionally to what just happened to me. And you're validating that, but I can feel her.
Yep.
Yeah.
Makes a big difference the minute that you give that acknowledgement. And I say that to people about any injury, whether it's a physical injury or a psychological injury, doesn't matter. It's the validation comes from being acknowledged. And unfortunately, especially in the psychological space, a lot of that acknowledgement doesn't happen until people enter into some form of therapy. Because even what we try and do as human beings is we try and negate other people's feelings. So, you know it, you're talking to your girlfriends and, you know, you'll be talking about something that makes you upset. They don't know how to resolve it for you, so they try and tell you not to worry about it. Well, just don't think about it. Just, you know, and they're trying to help you to repress it by, you know, redirecting your attention onto something else. But that's what makes it feel invalidating, right? But rather if we turn around and kind of go, wow, that sounds really tough and I wish I had an answer for you, but, you know, happy to just be here and drink coffee, you know, it changes it. I'm not trying to change what you're telling me that your perspective is, because really I shouldn't be trying to do that. But a lot of us try and step in and always go into that problem-solving mode for others.
I mean, I remember you giving a stat. So let's just take Australia. Obviously, this is healing trauma down under. On average, 25 million. How many psychologists, psychotherapists do we have? There's got to be an onus and responsibility for us to be part of our healing journey. Is that ridiculous is that such a ridiculous thing to wish, to want, to wonder?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I always say to people that, and I think I entered into psychology because I naturally wanted to help people. And I think I felt like by demonstrating how I might have overcome certain things that I might also, you know, help other people in the same way. And I think that it's an important point when you talk about the numbers. So there are less than 3,000 psychologists in private practice for 25 million people. And, you know, when the Prime Minister says last year, oh, look, just go and see them 20 times a year instead of 10, knowing full well that we don't actually have any available I think that that's where a big part of the problem comes from. And, you know, there are another 22,000 psychotherapists and counsellors who you can't get any access to Medicare rebates for. Quite frankly, I don't think they should go into the Medicare system either, because it just puts them all into that regulatory framework, which we find not working. But a big part of why I think it's, you know, time to step out from it is because I really want to empower people to help themselves, to see that trauma is a normal part of our human experience, and that what we need to understand is how we can resolve it. If we taught children, and I say this to people about your primary school age kids, pick them up from school and walk them home like we used to in the old days and ask them how their day was. That way, if they've had a bad day because somebody was being nasty to them, you've got that bilateral stimulation and they're walking it out as they're talking. I say the same thing with your girlfriends. If you're upset about something, don't sit and have a coffee, go for a walk and talk about the problem. So walk and talk is a big way that I say to people for you to help yourself in that moment about the things that are bothering you. Because you know it. If you just sit and talk to people, we can have that same conversation with half a dozen people and it's still the same. And we don't feel any differently about it. But in a walk and talk, it really does make a big difference, because we're allowing our own brain to process.
I'm going to use that. I love that. Thank you, Kerry.
You're welcome.
Yeah. One tip for me to take away.
Yeah.
I've had a million stories and analogies and different, back pocket tips, I think.
We need you to have those cards. I told you, I need you to have those cards that you just put on social media, because there's so many good things that we don't need to overthink. We don't need a degree to have it, but that walk and talk. But I think you just gave an explanation that I'm one of those people that needs to know why. I don't need to know all the reasons, but just why. And it was that, what did you call it? Was it that lateral, and my brain just like cogs just kind of got it. And the way you explained the brain, it just,
bilateral stimulation.
Yes. Okay. Do you have any more questions before I ask my next one?
Yeah,
no, that's all right.
I guess I'm just where do you see yourself heading if you're finding the world of psychology too restrictive? And I get this image of you trying to kind of like get your wings out and kind of poking up. And so kind of where are those wings taking you? Where do you see the future of trauma work going for you in Australia?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because part of the problem is that it's the restrictions that apply to Australia. I watched The Wisdom of Trauma recently with Gabor Mate, and one of the things about, if you've seen it yourself, one of the things about it, while I'm watching it, I'm kind of going, he's talking about all of the same things I talk about in the book, but, you see him touching people. I mean, the man sits with somebody who has ayahuasca, for goodness sake. We don't allow people to explore all of the different ways that they might want to explore within themselves about resolving their own trauma. He's on stage talking about people's lives and exploring things in front of thousands of other people. We're not allowed to do that in this country, right? So there's a lot of, I think, where I see myself is I really want to be able to speak to large audiences, not because I want to put other people on stage and unpack their life in front of others. I don't think that that's necessarily helpful, but trying to give people some insights around how we got to be like this and what are the sorts of things that they can do in order to resolve things for themselves. But I think in the book, I really unpack how we got to be like this and why we really need to do something about resolving it for ourselves. Because let's face it, there's not a lot of therapists out there that can actually give us what we need to resolve it. And I think that's part of the reason why people don't necessarily ask for help, because the stigma around it means that they're not sure that they can ever really resolve it. And honestly, I think that's because the psychological kind of story that we give in this country is that, it's not healing. It's just trying to, help you feel better in the moment in whatever way you can do that. But I think a lot of that is just not cutting the mustard anymore. And, people know that they can cognitive behavioural therapy, and that's part of the reason I write about it in the book, is about it's almost outlived its time because we're now so much more emotionally aware and we're raising generations of people who've got a lot of awareness around their own mental health and thought processes and how they feel, that we don't really need to just be told to, well, if you feel like this, just tell yourself all the times that you felt like that and then just shut it down again, because that's really what that process does.
Yeah, I get a lot of people come to me who have said, look, I've done my 10 sessions of CBT with a psychologist and just didn't work for me. Like, I need something more, I just see a lot of people who have the same. I really feel for those people who really need help and they're being sent away for 10 sessions of CBT.
Well, you think about it, CBT is very much about the thinking process, and it almost negates everything else and says that the only reason you feel or behave is because of how you think. And, yet we see it all the time where you can have people who experience a level of physiological depression that has got no bearing on how they think. And I've been working with clients much more recently because in the book I talk about how our gut is involved so strongly in our mental health that but it's a bit chicken and egg. but the gut was developed from the same part of the neural tube that your brain develops from. And so it makes sense that they're very strongly connected. We know that 95% of your serotonin is produced in your gut. When you don't feel good, you don't eat well, you end up kind of then creating a bit of a system that's then self-perpetuating. It's not doing very well. When we want to try and reverse it, CBT's like just do things differently and again, push the feelings down and push yourself, right? But our modern society, we don't have to do anything we don't want to if we don't feel like it anymore. You don't feel like it, you just lay on the couch, order Uber Eats and watch Netflix. We don't have to do anything. So feeling cannot be the only thing that we rely on to determine our actions.
So my brain automatically says, well, is anyone looking at the change in curriculum of how they're teaching and training psychologists and then every other, practitioner where that looks at mental health and trauma? Who's focusing on that? I mean, I don't know if I'm asking you, but what are we going to do? I mean, look at the pandemic is global. At some point, 5, 10, 20 years, we're going to start seeing the after effects. And I'm just wondering, are there any governments out there that are planning what it looks like to help people through this?
I would say no. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to step away from that regulatory kind of thing that I feel gags me, because there are things that we can do to help people, but we need to be able to do it through outlets that reach more people. The one-on-one, an hour of time stuff, it's not enough. And it doesn't, and I think I can have a similar conversation probably with, half a dozen people in the same week. So in half a dozen different sort of appointments, one-on-one, I can be explaining a similar concept or helping people understand the same thing. So for me, I think that being able to, have a bit more of a platform or a speaking voice, a bit like, Gabor Mate goes and speaks to large groups of people about what's going on and helps to normalise it. And then the one thing about his movie that I was a bit disappointed about is that it still looked that he was the solution. And I think this is the problem with, I say to people, the health regulation body kind of says we're the fishmongers of the world and you're not allowed to teach anybody how to fish for themselves. And I go, no way, you don't have enough fish. This is not the 5 loaves and 2 fishes story where you can't possibly feed millions of people. We need to teach them all to fish. We need to teach them all to understand their own mental health, that life throws you curveballs. You have to learn to duck and weave. There are ways that we can resolve these things. You just need to look at what's right for you, because not all the same for everybody either. We know that there are some systems that work really effectively for most people, but it doesn't mean that everybody has to do the same thing.
Kerry, I knew that this conversation was going to be juicy, but I'm almost gobsmacked and I'm trying to write at the same time. But before we wrap up and Jen, I'll put you on notice if you've got any questions. How can people reach you? How can they get your book? You speak about this 12-week program. When will it be available? We'll make sure this is all in the show notes, but tell us, how can we stay in touch with you?
So you can have a look on the trauma, the website for the book is called thetroublewithtrauma.com. My main website is kerryhoward.com.au. You can follow up on socials. I have at Kerry Howard Psych. I'm not very good on my socials, I must admit. Maybe if I get socials that are called the Pink Shrink, I'd be better on them. I don't know. It could be a bit more fun. There's a range of different things in terms of the mental muscle method is a program that I put together about resilience building, trying to work with organisations at the moment about putting that into place, because with COVID, trying to get people back into the workplace is a big thing, but also because Safe Work Australia now puts all of the onus and responsibility for wellbeing onto the employer. So that's a big thing that's happened out of COVID. And most business owners that I speak to really are struggling. They feel like they don't have the right skills or experience or background to enable them to address it appropriately, I think is probably the fair way to put it.
Organizations want to be hearing this loud and clear. 12 weeks, and like you said, we can't do this one-stop shop. It's like going to the gym for one day and saying, yeah, I'm going to build this muscle, and you're done.
Yes. And that's a big part of the reason why when I set up the mental muscle method, I made it over a 12-week program. A lot of people have sort of said, oh, well, where's the research and whatever about that? It's like, it makes sense that you can't change behavior just by attending a one-day workshop. That's why when we look at the transfer of learning stuff, you might have heard about the 70-20-10 rule. So the 10 is the 10% of, formal learning that you're supposed to do. But then on the job learning, then 20% is supposed to be about what you get mentored in, and 70% is from doing the job. Well, unless your job is about helping and supporting people, how are you supposed to know what's the right thing to do when we're interacting with our fellow human beings? And we make a lot of assumptions that we got that information from our parents appropriately or whatever. There's a whole bunch of reasons why a consistent approach around recognising first within ourselves, and that's where I think things like mental health first aid are good programs, but what they teach you is to observe it in other people and not in yourself. And yet the key to the resolution of all of these things is first actually looking at why I'm reacting in a particular way to something that somebody else has done, because it's always about the internal, whereas our society, and this has got worse with all of the focus on social media and stuff, is very much about the external focus, and what I'm feeling about myself is what I'm getting from my external world, whereas what we really need to do is tap back into our internal world.
Ooh, well, thank you. Jen, I don't know if you've got any questions or closing comments before we wrap up, but I already think we need Kerry back. But any last thoughts?
Yeah, I second that for sure. It's been so fabulous meeting you, Kerry. I'm going to go and get your book. I'm going to go through it. And yeah, I look forward to our next chat.
That would be great. My little diagram up on my wall here is actually from the book, and it's part of what's actually on the front cover, this half of the stuff, and just talks about our emotional as opposed to when we're kind of, being rational and moving our way forward in life. And I just think it's about helping people understand that all of those experiences are really pretty normal.
Yeah, and I love that because you talk about the different parts of us, the child, the adolescent. I highly recommend people get the book.
And it is available in audio book, Kimmy, and I did author that one so it's all my voice on it. So if you really want to listen to it, you can get the audio book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. Have a great day. It was awesome to meet you.
You too.